How did a single stone help a civilization speak after more than 3,000 years of silence? That is exactly what the Rosetta Stone did. Today it is kept in the British Museum. The slab is dark, damaged, and almost unremarkable in appearance. But carved into it is the same decree in 3 different writing systems at once: hieroglyphic, Demotic, and ancient Greek. The stone was found in 1799 by Napoleon's soldiers near the town of Rashid, which in Europe was called Rosetta. At first it seemed like simply a rare find. Everything changed because of the Greek text. Scholars already understood it in part and gained a point of comparison. Then a real intellectual hunt began. Researchers searched for repetitions, compared formulas, and identified cartouches containing the names of rulers. Thomas Young was the first to suggest that hieroglyphs conveyed not only ideas but sounds as well. Then Jean-François Champollion went further. He used his knowledge of the Coptic language and proved that Egyptian writing was a complex mixed system, not just a set of sacred symbols. This text turned out to be a decree from the time of Ptolemy V, issued in 1960 CE. Greek served as the language of administration. Demotic script was used in everyday bureaucracy. Hieroglyphs were preserved for temples and monuments. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we explore how archaeology changes our understanding of the ancient world. The Rosetta Stone did not become a miracle of a single day, but the key to a long decipherment. Step by step it turned a mystery into a readable system and opened direct access to the history of ancient Egypt. Order was first fixed in stone and grain. Later it began to be fixed in words. That is how ancient societies learned to manage uncertainty. The Harappan civilization shows this especially clearly. Large brick platforms and structures resembling granaries stood within a clearly laid out urban grid. Their scale speaks of coordination. Their location near public areas suggests administration. This was not about the reserves of a single family, but a system for collecting and distributing surplus. This transition is even more visible at Amarna. In Akhenaten's short-lived capital, archaeologists found hundreds of clay tablets. These are the famous Amarna letters. They were preserved by fire and abandonment, not by the care of archivists. The tablets were written in Akkadian, in cuneiform, even though Egypt used hieroglyphs. This is an important detail. What we see is not random correspondence, but part of a broader diplomatic system. In the letters, people ask for gold, complain about allies, and demand military assistance. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine how entire worlds are reconstructed from fragments of text. Egypt appears here not as an isolated power, but as a node in a vast network connected to the Levant, Babylon, and neighboring kingdoms. And then power began to speak not on clay, but on the walls of tombs. The pyramid texts, carved at the end of the 24th and the beginning of the 23rd centuries BCE, became Egypt's earliest religious texts. Repeated formulas, the names of gods, and instructions for the journey after death show the essential point. Writing preserved not only memory, but the very legitimacy of power. The pyramid texts matter not only as funerary formulas. They show how Egypt ordered the invisible side of power itself. If granaries stored bread, then these inscriptions stored ritual knowledge. Access to it belonged to the king and the priests. In this way, writing secured continuity even after the ruler's death. Some researchers go further. They believe that some of the formulas may have preserved not only religious meaning, but cosmological ideas as well, possibly even early observations of the sky, hidden in the language of myth. There is no complete certainty here. The oral tradition has been lost, and local differences have reached us only in part. But the overall logic is clear. Again and again, Egypt created systems of order for resources, memory, and fate. Against this background, the dream stele of Thutmose IV stands out especially strongly. It stood between the paws of the Great Sphinx at Giza. This is no longer a funerary text or an administrative record. It is the story of a dream that explains the right to the throne. According to the inscription, the young prince fell asleep by the Sphinx. In his dream, the deity Horemakhet appeared to him. It promised him royal power if the prince cleared the sand from the statue. Such a narrative worked with great precision. It linked the rise of Thutmose IV not merely to inheritance, but to direct divine choice. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we explore how ancient texts turned power into sacred history. Archaeologists date the stele to the 18th dynasty. This fits well with the ideology of the New Kingdom, where the pharaoh constantly reaffirmed his special relationship with the gods. And here is what is especially curious. The actual clearing of sand from the Sphinx most likely really was necessary, but in the text, a practical task was transformed into a sign of heavenly chosenness. That is exactly how writing changed the perception of events. It recorded not only the fact, but also the desired meaning. The dream stela became the point where the restoration of a monument, religion, and political legitimacy merged into a single whole. At the same time, the question remains how much of this text is personal memory, how much is priestly editing, and how much is later ideological reworking. It is precisely from this line that the next stage of Egyptian writing grows, where the record no longer encompasses the dream of a single king, system of the state as a whole. These references to foreign peoples must be read carefully. They do not provide an exact ethnographic portrait. More often, this is the language of war, diplomacy, and power. Therefore, Israel in such texts most likely denotes not a state in the usual sense, but a socio-ethnic group of the late Bronze Age Levant. This is an important detail. An ancient inscription does not simply report facts. It also shapes the desired image of the enemy. Lists of peoples, geographical names, and the poetic form itself could function both as ritual and as a political statement. Marginal theories about hidden chronology or a secret code sound striking, but archaeology and comparative epigraphy do not confirm them. If you look at the Merneptah stela alongside papyri archives and funerary texts, a common line becomes visible. Writing increasingly serves not only to record events, it determines how those events will be remembered. A military campaign becomes a narrative, and the narrative turns into sanctioned memory. Therefore, the stele most likely combines a military report, a religious assertion, and political propaganda. But the boundary between real description, rhetorical exaggeration, and priestly editing is not entirely clear. Then the perspective shifts, no longer toward conquests, but toward how ancient societies learned to manage stability. In the cities of the Harappan civilization, granaries were built from fired brick according to uniform standards. They were incorporated into the overall urban layout. Nearby ran canals, roads, and public spaces. These were not private barns, but elements of a large system. And here lies the key to understanding power without a palace. Uniform brick proportions and modular structure point to coordinated labor and materials. Their proximity to public infrastructure hints at controlled distribution of supplies. The harvest was probably brought in from the surrounding areas, stored and distributed by season. In this way, grain was turned into predictability. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we explore how the history of civilizations is built from brick, text. The Harappan model seems to have differed from the palace economies of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Here researchers more often speak of a decentralized, yet highly organized system. Perhaps urban institutions or trading groups played an important role. There is another version as well. Some complexes may have been not only warehouses, but also tax collection points or regulated markets. And then comes a particularly interesting turn. From storing grain, humanity moves to storing knowledge. In ancient Egypt, this is visible in the Edwin Smith Papyrus. It is one of the earliest medical texts, dated to around the 16th century BCE. It probably copies an even older source. The text is structured almost like a clinical manual. Examination of the injury, signs, diagnosis, treatment, skull fractures, facial injuries, spinal trauma. Instead of spells alone, there are bandages, sutures, and immobilization. This is how an early attempt appears to systematize observation and turn experience into method. Egypt's funerary texts are often read not only as religion, but also as a map of the fear of death. They project anxiety, judgment, and hope into an external order. Scholars of mythology see echoes here of other ancient ideas about the soul's journey. But theories about secret astronomical codes sound dramatic, while archaeology and language do not support them. From this grows an important idea. Ancient societies sought to impose order on everything unstable. Granaries protected food. Medical papyri protected the body. Funerary texts protected the passage into another life. Writing here functioned as a tool for controlling uncertainty. By the way, if you are interested in these kinds of links between texts, power, and everyday life, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine the ancient world precisely through such details. The same logic can be seen in the cities of the Indus Valley civilization. Archaeologists find large granaries there on raised platforms. They were built from standardized fired brick. The layout was sectional. The walls were made thick. Nearby there were often canals and delivery routes. All this points not to a simple warehouse, but to a system of accounting and distribution. Society knew how to collect surpluses, store them, and survive seasonal disruptions. In almost the same way, Egypt managed not grain, but memory. A vivid example is the Abydos king list. It was created under Seti I in the 13th century BCE on the wall of the temple at Abydos. The names of the pharaohs were carved in even rows. Each cartouche was inscribed with almost architectural precision. At first glance it is simply a chronicle, but the list is extremely selective. Some rulers are absent, especially those associated with crises or religious conflicts. Therefore, the inscription was not a neutral archive, but a political statement. It preserved the past and at the same time edited it. Seti I and Ramesses II were placed within an ideal line of legitimate kings. In the Temple of Osiris, this had special force, because there the memory of the ancestors was joined with the cult of the afterlife. There is also a subtler reading. The list may have served as a ritual object. The very carving of the names may have symbolically summoned the kings of the past into temple action. Then what we have before us is not simply history, but the management of time. Just as a granary organizes reserves, so a king list organizes legitimate memory. But the debates remain. In different temples, the lists differ. That means Egypt probably did not have a single version of the past. Scribes may have relied both on archives and on oral tradition. That is why the Abydos list is doubly important. It shows not only who ruled, but also how the state wanted to remember itself. Similar tasks in the Rhind papyrus may not have been abstract theory, but working schemes for large projects. We are talking about the calculation of areas, volumes, plots of land, and supplies. All of this is directly connected with construction, irrigation, and the distribution of resources. Such a text most likely helped scribes preserve uniform rules of calculation so that different people would calculate in the same way. Comparison with the Indus Valley civilization makes this idea even stronger. There, order manifested itself in brick and layout. Here it manifested itself in numbers and fractions. The granaries of the Indus Valley show how a society standardized space. The Rhind papyrus shows how it may have standardized calculation. In both cases, abstraction helped manage complexity. But researchers still have no complete certainty. It remains unclear whether the papyrus was a direct reflection of everyday practice or a teaching collection of ideal problems. It is possible that real craftsmen often calculated more simply, relying on experience and local methods. There is another important possibility as well. The Rhind papyrus may have been only part of a much broader mathematical tradition, of which only fragments have survived. This is especially visible in the very style of Egyptian mathematics. What matters in it are step-by-step procedures, repetition and work with unit fractions. Such an approach suggests not a love of abstract formulas, but a desire to teach action. Knowledge was transmitted through example, through repetition, through an established order. By the way, if you are interested in such details, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine how ancient societies turned knowledge into an instrument of governance. From this follows the main conclusion. The Rhind papyrus most likely served both as a textbook and as a reference for scribes. It was grounded in the real needs of the state, in measuring land, planning work and accounting for supplies. But the boundary between school and practice is still blurred. Further on, the same logic of order appears no longer in numbers, but in architecture and memory. In the cities of the Indus Valley, granaries were not just warehouses. They were nodes in a larger system. They were built from identical fired brick. They were integrated into the urban network. Nearby ran drainage channels and transport routes. All this points to control over the storage and movement of grain. And then an even more important transition takes place, from storing the harvest to storing time. This is precisely where the Palermo stone appears. It is a fragment of ancient Egyptian royal annals, carved on dark basalt. It lists rulers and records the events of each year, festivals, dedications, administrative acts, and even the levels of the Nile flood. In this way, ancient Egypt tried to measure not only resources, but the very course of history itself. The coffin texts performed not one task, but many at once. Some spells protected the deceased. Others helped them assume a divine form. Still others guided them through the dangers of the afterlife and gave knowledge of sacred names, gates, and places. And what is especially important here is this: the order of these texts often changed. This means there was no rigid canon. What we have before us is not a closed book of rules, but a flexible system that could be assembled in different ways. That is why researchers speak of an important shift. Knowledge that had previously been associated above all with royal power and the pyramids became accessible to a wider circle of elite people. This was a major turning point. It spoke not only about religion, but also about society. After the weakening of the old centralized power, funerary knowledge began to move beyond royal exclusivity. In this way, the coffin texts combined continuity and innovation. They preserved the ancient Egyptian picture of the world, but expanded the circle of those who could use it. The spells themselves depict a very complex cosmology. The deceased passes through gates, meets guardians, crosses rivers, and reaches heavenly regions. On this journey, it is not strength that decides, but knowledge. A name, a formula, an exact word. Language here is not description, but an instrument of action. A correctly spoken word literally helps one survive after death. And perhaps their role was not limited to that. Some scholars believe that such texts also served as a support for priests. They may have preserved oral rituals in written form. Then the coffin became not just a casket, but a portable archive of sacred knowledge. There is yet another dimension as well, a psychological one. Detailed formulas of protection and transformation probably gave a person a sense of order in the face of death. The repetition of spells may have reduced fear and strengthened confidence. By the way, if you are interested in such details, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine how ancient texts reveal the thinking of entire civilizations, but there was still no complete standardization. The set of spells on different coffins differs noticeably. That means the selection depended on local tradition, personal beliefs, or the advice of priests. Therefore, the coffin texts are better understood as a living and changing corpus. It reflected a society of a transitional era, where ancient tradition still held firm, yet was already adapting to new conditions. Archaeology confirms this. Such sarcophagi were placed in carefully prepared tombs together with offerings for the afterlife. That means the texts were part of a larger system in which objects, ritual, and the spoken word were joined together. And that is their main meaning. They made immortality not a universal right, but no longer solely a royal privilege either. Grain in the Indus Valley was not simply piled into granaries. It was collected from the surrounding area, measured by uniform standards, stored in protected spaces, and then distributed according to the season and the needs of the community. Such a scheme is impossible without clear administration. Even if the script of this civilization has still not been deciphered, the architecture itself says a great deal. Order here rested not on grand inscriptions, but on layout, modules, and the standard of the brick. And here an important turn takes place. From the storage of grain, the story moves to the storage of experience. No longer of supplies but of memory, not of law but of human destiny. This brings us to the tale of Sinuhe, one of the most subtle texts of ancient Egypt. It was created in the Middle Kingdom, roughly between 1900 and 1800 BCE. The tale has come down to us in several papyrus copies. This is an important detail. It suggests that the text was widely known, and probably served as a teaching model in scribal schools. The language here is classical Middle Egyptian. It is precise, rhythmic, and clearly literary. This is not the dry report of an official. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine ancient texts not as dusty artifacts, but as living witnesses of their age. The plot begins abruptly. After the death of Pharaoh Amenemhat I, the official Sinuhe flees Egypt in fear. The reason is not panic alone. Behind it lies an atmosphere of courtly anxiety and the expectation of turmoil. Sinuhe goes to the Levant, settles in a foreign land, rises to high status, starts a family, and builds a new life. But success does not cancel out the main thing. His longing for Egypt does not disappear. So before us is not just a personal story. It is a reflection on loyalty, belonging, and the price of exile. Sinuhe's return to Egypt appears as a restoration of order. In this sense, the text supports the idea of legitimate power and the special status of Egypt. Foreign lands may be rich, but in the logic of the tale, they still fall short of the homeland, where the proper order exists. And yet researchers see more here than ideology. Sinu's inner conflict is often regarded as one of the earliest literary explorations of a personality in exile. In addition, the text shows knowledge of the real Levant, its roads, elites, and political ties. That means we have before us not only artistic fiction, but also a reflection of the real world. In this way, ancient societies preserved not only bread, but also human experience, fear, loss, and the hope of return. The text of Ptolemy can be read not only as a collection of wise advice. It may well have served as a teaching model for the elite training of scribes. Not only the thought matters, the form matters too. The literary polish, clear parallelism, and rhetorical balance suggest that this text was studied for its style as well. In this way, future officials were trained not only to act properly, but also to speak properly. In this sense, the instruction functioned as a storehouse of norms. Only what it stored was not grain, but rules of conduct. Each maxim set out a separate model of action. Together they supported the stability of official and social life. But there is no complete clarity here. The surviving text is a late copy. Therefore, the exact authorship is unknown. It is also unclear to what extent the written version matches the original. It is possible that scribes altered the wording to fit new social norms. Some scholars consider this text an ideal of bureaucratic behavior rather than a description of real practice. Others believe that it reflects an actual system of education in which scribes were taught both the technique of writing and ethical discipline. Most likely, the truth lies somewhere between these positions. By the way, if details like these interest you, here we examine how ancient texts actually functioned in society. There is another important possibility as well. These sayings may have lived orally for a long time before they were written down on papyrus. This could explain the rhythm, the repetitions, and the form convenient for memorization. Then the instruction of Ptolemy becomes not merely a written monument, but the result of a long oral tradition. Further on, the logic of survival moves from text into architecture. In the cities of the Indus Valley civilization, granaries were built as part of an overall system of administration. They were set on raised platforms. Standard fired brick was used. Drainage was arranged nearby. Inside, the space was divided into sections. All this points to control of access, accounting of supplies, and thoughtful distribution of resources. Even without a deciphered script, archaeology shows something important. Order here was expressed not only in words, but in the very layout of the city. From this material logic grows another type of memory, no longer about grain, but about power. Thus the narrative leads us to the Karnak king list. This is not just a list of names. It is a carefully selected history, carved in the temple of Amun under Thutmose III. Some rulers were included in the list, and others excluded. That means what we have before us is not a neutral chronicle, but an instrument for selecting memory, where history serves the legitimacy of power. The inventory stela is important not only as an inscription. It shows the very principle of power in ancient Egypt. Society rested on two supports at once. The first support was grain, storehouses, accounting and distribution. The second was texts, memory, ritual, and the right to speak in the name of the past. Granaries provided survival. Stelae provided meaning. Together they created stability. Some controlled food and supplies. Others controlled belief, the legitimacy of power, and collective memory. This is precisely where the main conclusion is hidden. Ancient rulers held the country together not only by force and taxation, they also governed how people understood the world. The inventory stela shows this mechanism especially clearly. Even if some individual historical details are disputed, its function is understandable. It does not merely convey information. It legitimizes, explains, and directs the perception of the past. And that makes it a political instrument, not merely a monument of writing. Beside this, the granaries appear especially expressive. On the banks of the Nile, such structures were the foundation of the economy. They were made of brick, set on solid foundations, and divided into sections. Such a layout helped preserve grain, account for volumes, and protect supplies from spoilage. The geometry and repetition of forms speak of standards, and standards almost always mean centralized administration. From here, the transition to texts looks natural. The granary preserved the harvest, the written monument preserved knowledge, and the idea of order. And in this sense, the stela and the storehouse worked in surprisingly similar ways. One retained a material resource. The other retained the required version of the past. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine how ancient societies govern not only things, but meanings. The most interesting thing is that this principle did not disappear. Already in antiquity, control over food, memory and ritual was part of a single system. Whoever controlled supplies influenced life. Whoever controlled the story of the past influenced the legitimacy of power. That is why the inventory stela is not just an artifact. It is a mirror of an entire civilization. In it one can see its fears, its ways of imposing order, and its desire to repeat the necessary version of reality. History here appears not as a chain of events, but as an instrument. Through such monuments, Egypt preserved not only its heritage, but the very structure of society itself. Identical brick proportions across vast distances are rarely accidental. This is a strong sign of a common standard, and that means that behind the granaries of the Indus Valley, there most likely stood not local improvisation. Here grain was not simply stored. It was collected, kept and distributed according to rules. Structures like these helped keep food, labor and the risk of crop failure under control. From this logic emerges an important parallel. If a granary protected people from hunger, then texts protected society from oblivion and fear. And that is exactly how history leads us to the famine stela in Egypt. This monument was carved on the island of Sahel near Aswan. The inscription itself is dated to the Ptolemaic period, roughly the 3rd century BCE. But its story carries the listener much farther back, to the time of Pharaoh Djoser of the 3rd dynasty. The text tells of a 7-year famine. The Nile does not flood. Crops perish. The land stops feeding the people. At the same time, rituals continue, but the familiar natural order collapses. This is where the stela's main meaning lies hidden. It explains the disaster not only through nature. Here famine is shown as a rupture in the bond between people, the land and the gods. For Egyptian thought, this was fundamental. The stability of nature depended on Ma'at, that is, on cosmic order. If that order is broken, the country suffers as well. Traditionally, scholars regard the famine stela as a religious text from the Ptolemaic period. It reinforced the authority of the temple and the cult of the god Khnum, who was associated with the flooding of the Nile. In other words, the inscription functioned not only as myth, but also as an instrument of power. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine how ancient texts concealed politics under the guise of sacred history. There is another view as well. Some scholars allow that the text may have been based on memories of real climatic crises. Later, these were cast into religious form. That is why the stela may be at once a myth, a political manifesto, and an echo of an old ecological catastrophe. From this comes a very precise comparison. The granary preserved food. The stela preserved an explanation. One fought scarcity materially. The other fought chaos through meaning. And in both cases, ancient societies were trying to do the same thing. Turn the unpredictability of nature into manageable order. The inventory stela and the Bentrech stela are important not as simple records, but as instruments of power. In the first case, the stone lists sacred objects and gifts, supposedly going back to King Khufu. In the second, the text tells of healing through the intervention of Egyptian gods. But in both monuments, the main thing is not an exact chronicle, but the creation of authority. The Bentrech stela is usually dated to the Ptolemaic period. Most researchers see in it a theological text that presents the Egyptian gods as a force acting even beyond the borders of Egypt. Illness in the story disrupts order. Then diplomacy enters. After that, divine intervention restores balance. Such a scheme is too neatly constructed to be considered a simple record of events. More likely, it is a carefully designed religious composition. At the same time, the text may have preserved memories of real contacts between Egypt and the Levant. Historically, the plot itself cannot be proven, but the very idea of long-distance connections, healing cults, and royal diplomacy fits quite well into the picture of the ancient Near East. And this is where the most interesting part lies hidden. The inscription may not only have told a story, but also participated in ritual, convincing people that the statue of the god truly acted and healed. By the way, if details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine how ancient texts were turned into political weapons. The inventory stela works in a similar way. It links the temple to legendary royal patronage, and thereby strengthens the rights of the priests, the prestige of the sanctuary, and its claims to resources. Archaeologists have long noticed that stylistically it belongs to a later period, not to the time of Khufu himself. So most likely what we have before us is not an authentic report from the Old Kingdom, but a retrospective statement that frames memory as a legitimate basis of power. This is why both stelae are so important. They show how ancient Egypt turned stone into a means of controlling meaning. Through a list of gifts or a story of healing, the same idea was created. The gods act, the temples are legitimate, and the priests possess special access to the order that defeats chaos. Historical accuracy here is not always clear, but the ideological purpose is very clearly visible. The inventory stela in Egypt functioned not as a simple monument. It organized power, memory, and cult in the same way that a granary organized food supplies. For ancient societies, it was important to preserve not only grain and goods. No less valued were rights to power, sacred connections, and the necessary version of the past. Archaeology, however, does not confirm that Pharaoh Khufu himself gave the temple the gifts described. Therefore, the stela most likely combines different eras into one advantageous narrative. Such a device was common in Egypt. Temples often created inscriptions about ancient royal patronage in order to strengthen their authority in the present, and this is precisely the stela's main role. Even if the details are disputed, its legitimizing function is obvious. A similar principle can be seen at Karnak. There, the king list carved under Thutmose III arranged rulers in a strict sequence inside the Temple of Amun. At first glance, this is the history of Egypt. But the list is selective. Some names are included, others disappear. That means we are looking not simply at a chronicle, but at an instrument of memory and power. And this is especially important. The absence of a name could mean no less than its presence. If details like these interest you, subscribe to the channel. Here we examine how architecture and inscriptions governed entire civilizations. The same order can be seen in the Indus Valley. There, granaries made of fired brick had standard proportions, sections, and drainage. They show control over supplies, labor, and distribution. It turns out that different civilizations were solving the same problem. They were turning chaos into a system. In one case through grain, in another through stone, ritual, and memory.